Great. Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy, and I'll serve as the host today. As usual, we are in a hybrid format. Thrilled to have a standing room only crowd here in Rubenstein 414. Also thrilled to have our friends and alumni and colleagues joining us on the Zoom webinar. We're really excited today to have with us Anne Finucane. Anne is Senior Advisor to TPG Rise Climate Fund and Chair of its carbon credit company, Rubicon Carbon. She recently retired as Vice Chair of Bank of America, where she spent more than 2 decades helping shape the bank's global strategy and leading many of its sustainability and environmental initiatives. In particular, she established and co-chaired the bank's $1 trillion climate finance initiative. Many leaders across the public and private sector have sought Anne's counsel. She served on a number of corporate boards. She's a member of Bank of America's Global Advisory Council, Council on Foreign Relations, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Geopolitical Advisory Council, and she was a member of both the President's Intelligence Advisory Board and the Department of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board during the Biden administration. Throughout her career, Anne has been a leading voice on the role of finance in addressing global challenges, including how capital markets, carbon markets, and nature-based solutions can support a transition to a low-carbon economy. Anne, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you.
So let's start sort of big picture. When we think about the perspective of the financial sector, what's at stake? What's the scale of the kind of investment we need as we undertake the clean energy transition?
Well, thank you. Thanks for being here. Hi, everybody. As you know, the International Energy Agency thinks that it takes $4 trillion a year. So it's an $120 trillion endeavor to get to 2050 and make a net zero goal. I'm not so sure about that. First of all, the numbers have risen because of AI. And we are at about half that now. I know you recently had Ethan Zinder, and he brought you through the Bloomberg's NEF, which, by the way, we all refer to. It's really a very good Bible to keep for all of us. But we're at about 2.3 trillion today in expenditure, which is half of what we need, but twice what we had 5 years ago. So it just gives you a sense of the trajectory of movement. And I do think there's some externalities that have changed the dynamics, and the movement will be quicker. I think we will be at 4 trillion fairly soon.
So when we look at these kinds of investments, a big challenge for financial institutions is being able to identify what is financially viable.
Right.
So going from sort of big picture, the aggregate capital flows, to the work of identifying specific projects and specific technologies, what do you look at to determine when a technology or a project is financeable?
Well, the U part is pretty broad. So the financial world is sort of broken. I'm going to sort of simplify this. Many of you know it, but it's kind of a good way to think about it. There's venture capital, private equity, and banks. And it's the venture people that are the real risk takers. They identify where they think there's an opportunity. It can be 2 guys in a garage, it can be 3 women in a shop, but the point is they see something that they think is scalable. So a good idea for them is they see the value of it and what could be done with it. But it's to make it even viable, it's got to be scalable. It's got to be you can reproduce it, and it's got to be exportable. So that's what they look at. The venture capital people take huge risks, huge swings, and if they're right, they make a lot of money. The next group is private equity. So the private equity world is sort of circling the venture world. They're watching their opportunities, and they come in right after that. What the private equity people are doing is they truly scale this. They take that good idea that now has been proven to a point. The field tests have been done, if you will, with venture, and they will take it and invest. They may borrow money, they may put equity in, they may change the management team, but they'll do whatever they think it is to make this company viable. And viable mean that they sell it, they join with others, but they're going to make money on it. Banks are a different cat completely. Banks are where private equity goes to finance something to make the company bigger. And it's based on, do they have collateral? They do, because they have other companies. Um, and do they have a track record? Most private equity firms do have a track record. So the banks are financing something that they think will grow. Project finance was sort of a thing years ago, and it is just a very big business now in banking. Another thing that's big in banking is green bonds. So this is the same as municipal bonds. It's just got a tag to be green. You have to prove that whatever it is you were borrowing against, at the end of it, there's a tangible proof that it was a green project. Not that it was successful, which is a little bit different. That it was the attributes are purely green. And I was around when we first introduced this. Citibank ourselves, a couple of NGOs, World Bank worked together. We created a sort of a capital markets framework so that we could make it into a capital market play. And we couldn't get it going. It was sort of nowhere. And part of it was the financial crisis. But by 2015, it was a real business, and today it's in the trillions annually.
So you mentioned scale a couple of times. In fact, then just gave an example of how this market has scaled up
Right.
considerably. When you look at climate going forward, what do you see as the most important barriers that need to be overcome to effectively scale the deployment of climate-friendly technologies?
Well, there's some realities of, political leadership thinking it's a ruse. That's not particularly productive. Um, but there are some, I don't really see the barriers. I see the opportunities as being something different than what we thought. So in the early days of greening companies, if you will, it was a mission that was associated with ESG. Good thing to do, the right thing to do, but a bit of a penance. It's really changed. What has made it change? Well, one is energy security by countries. You look at the EU, and it has a lot of rules around the Green Deal, but they simply weren't ready when Russia invaded Ukraine, and they didn't have the energy supply they needed, and they hadn't gotten far enough on renewables. And had they been far enough in renewables, they wouldn't need to import something. So that becomes a security issue. We're looking at right today, Asia, Japan, China, India, having huge problems, potential problems if the Strait of Hormuz is really closed down, and the Middle East, but particularly the Gulf, chooses not to send their fuel in. That's a huge issue. So in each of these countries, they're thinking about how do I protect myself, and the way they protect themselves is to have more renewable energy. It is, it is independent of that kind of thing. So that's a big thing. Supply chain out of COVID also changed. So Amazon, we were just talking about this,
Mhm.
is just a pretty good example of they got together with this group called Global Optimism. So they're like an environmental group. You'd think that was not particularly, where was the connection there? But Global Optimism is run by Christiana Figueres, who was a real principal player in the Paris Climate Agreement. And out of that, she recognized you had to have scalable capitalistic behavior to scale what she imagined the world could be. And so they joined with Amazon, and they work with 600 companies just in a simple thing on supply chain, how to use less fuel, how to condense packaging, just very practical things, which, by the way, also make reduce your costs. They don't raise your cost. Um, So that's another one. These are the kinds of things that you think about, and AI is the last, which is we're going to need so much energy, and most of it electricity, and so much of it can be done by renewables.
So you brought up the Paris Agreement.
Mhm.
Let's talk a little bit about the intersection of public policy and climate finance. The Paris Agreement was the first time we had an international agreement uh, by governments, but they talked about what non-state actors in their parlance can do, including what we could see in the private sector and in the financial sector. When you look at the Paris Agreement in 2015, in what way did it inform or influence what large financial institutions would do and undertake to address climate risk?
Yeah, I think the Paris Agreement was the single biggest pivot point for companies' capitalism. First of all, we were out of the drama of the financial crisis. We were now, 7 years beyond it, but actually for the financial world, we were just a few years out. Uh, but we were stabilized globally, and we could pay attention. And we saw two things. If I may just sort of stick with the financial sector, we saw two things. One, some heavy breathing happening from governments, from employees, and from the NGO community of the realities of the environment. So we were no longer talking about the Arctic or coral reefs. We were talking about some risk factors that we were beginning to see: erosion of coastal lands, a lot of fires, insurance company. You can't get a mortgage um, if you don't have insurance, and you can't be insured in certain parts of the country. So these were the practical issues we began to see. And anyway, Paris had the first, I was at the Paris convening, the COP21, and we had hundreds of companies in a room with government leaders, NGOs, just trying to figure out what could you practically do. And the whole idea of scope 1, 2, and 3 made sense to us. We can talk about that in a little while if you want. We understood both the risks and maybe the opportunities. Not everyone embraced it, but those that did began to see business opportunities. And just simply put, we did make $1 trillion commitment to green at Bank of America. And I retired sort of 5 years into it. They're in the sort of later stages that they're blowing through those numbers. They've because there's business opportunities. Just project finance alone would take care of it.
Now, you mentioned how you and many other leaders from finance were in Paris.
Mhm.
One thing we've seen over the years, especially in recent years, at the climate change negotiations, so much of the activity is outside the formal talks by the negotiators of the countries. It's really more of this convening and sort of focal point to bring leaders from business, from the NGO community, and from different parts of the public sector to talk about where we can make progress going forward. Fast forward to 2021, we've skipped a year because of the pandemic and getting countries together. The UK host in Glasgow the climate change talks, and we see the emergence now of this alliance among financial institutions towards net zero. Net zero is now a driving theme of Glasgow and subsequent talks. So share with us a little bit about what Glasgow meant and represented for the financial sector and the next steps on that path towards net zero.
Yeah. So in the sort of years between, there was a lot of work being done, but I think that Mark Carney and John Kerry, uh, and John Kerry is a sort of pull through in all of this. You know, he begins at Earth Day in 1970, and he just never lets go. Uh,
Persistence is one way to describe.
yeah, persistence, but he also evolved. So did Mark Carney. Um, to realize they really needed to make headway with capitalism. and they needed to be convincing that this wasn't a penance but an opportunity.
Mhm.
And so GFANS and other acronyms I could go through, but it's basically a banking alliance or a financial alliance. There were two of them. And the idea was that we would seek to be net zero. So I was at those negotiations. I was a quarterback for the banks to sort of convince us to do it. But we had an element that was part of this, which would be we could get standards, um, carbon accounting standards, standards on what it took to be net zero that we could use in the financial world, in the in the framework that Wall Street, capital markets, the trading desks could understand. Fast forward, that really didn't happen. The second thing is that we could use carbon credits. And we signed on with the explicit understanding that we could use carbon credits. What are carbon credits? Simply put, as you do your carbon audit for your company, scopes 1, 2, and 3, which are essentially one is what you do in your own business, 2 is the energy that you buy, and 3 is the rest of the world in your supply chain, your vendors, your employees, your customers. The banks saw the opportunity for their customers, particularly their clients. And the clients were meeting with us to say, we'd like to do this inventory too. We think it's inevitable. If they were working in Europe, they had to do it. It was required. If they were doing business in California, they had to do it. The rules were a little different, but at any rate, we all did that, and you realized that you had a delta on scope 1 and 2. 3, that was put aside. Now, the NGOs were talking about scope 3 constantly, but the companies weren't. They were really just trying to figure out how can you get to be carbon neutral, which would be scopes 1 and 2, and they couldn't do it, nor could their clients. Why couldn't they do it? Because the grids aren't linked. So you can't buy the energy that you can buy isn't always going to be green. If you're operating a company that you're making a building, the steel and cement, they're not green. And there's no vendor to buy the green. So go back to the venture group.
Right.
You're constantly looking for this, but it's not there yet. So as a result, there was sort of a detente here in that the companies saw that what they could do. They were willing to do the carbon audit. They were willing to buy the carbon credits. They were willing to be transparent about it. And then this allegation of greenwashing happened, and it paralyzed companies because they thought this was what everyone wanted them to do. Now this was being evaluated as just greenwashing. You're just buying your way to this, and you're not really doing anything. But I will tell you, I think the companies were absolutely honest in trying to figure out what to do. But the delta is large and will get smaller over time. And if you're going to be transparent, it just doesn't really make sense to me that it was such a crushing blow. But between Glasgow and going to Dubai on COP28, that really remained, it became a problem.
I want to get back to carbon offsets and greenwashing in just a moment.
Okay.
Before we do that, I'd like for you to sort of, since we're here at a school of government, sort of compare for us the policy framework in the EU. They have an emissions trading system, disclosure requirements, a financial taxonomy. How does that contrast in terms of how it informs the work you do in finance for clean energy investment? How to compare and contrast that with what we've had in the US, which has been primarily a subsidy approach through the tax code. The Inflation Reduction Act is, of course, fresh in everyone's minds, but we've been subsidizing clean energy through the tax code for decades in the US as really sort of the primary means to drive clean energy investment. From your standpoint in finance, what are the relative attractiveness and incentives you see, and what may be some of the challenges you experience under these two approaches?
Well, I'll go through those, but the real thing is US to China. So if I can just, I'll park that, we can come back to that. The EU has a lot of rules and regulations, but many of them haven't been implemented. So you're really just doing, you're applying the taxonomy. You have to make this report every year. I think it's all of these CSRD, where you comply with what they're asking for, which is essentially your carbon expression, if you will, as a company. And if you're a US company and operating in the EU, you have to do it. And then there's the ETS, which is essentially you get an allocation for how much carbon you can emit by industry. And if you go over it, you're taxed either uh, basically a tax from the country, or you trade with a company that's under their allocation. I'm really simplifying this. But it turned out very few people were under it because of the sort of problems I just explained. Um, so that's become a little, the ETS has become it works, but it's a bit of a problem. And they are looking at quietly what to do because they have another set of problems. The other set of problems is the member states are being, shall we say, challenged because they have to put more money into defense, given this NATO set of issues. So they have less domestic money. Uh, they would like to find a way the tax. If you tax a company, it's all to green your country. This is a little inconvenient. So they're looking right now, for instance, at the agricultural community, which is one of the largest lobbies in the EU, and they get a lot of money, but that money is being squeezed by the need for defense.
Mhm.
Could you create carbon credits by having regenerative farming practices that will generate more carbon sequestration, which they can prove, but you see what this is like. It's a lot of issues going through a very thin tube. And the EU has a lot of rules, but the implementation is slow, and they are changing some of the rules as we speak. The US is, and it's all to me, if it's carrot and stick, it's all stick in the EU. In the US, the IRA was very, first of all, it was unexpected. As great as it was, it sort of arrived unexpectedly. And it came along with the Infrastructure Act, which might have been more important because that's where you're talking about linking grids and bridges, et cetera. But it was also short-lived. So it was probably anticipated to be about $700 billion worth of help. It probably ended up to be a couple of hundred billion, maybe more, if you factor in all the variables. AI is multiplied that many times over. AI will require about $500 billion of investment every year. And if you apply renewable energy to their electricity needs, you have a home run. So you don't need the tax credits. You just need the renewable energy. And solar is 50%, well, solar, wind, and battery storage together is about 50%, less expensive today than it was 5 years ago. These things are economically very attractive.
Um, I want to get to this, but you wanted to put aside US China. Do you want to talk a little bit about US China, or should we come back to that later?
We'll come back to that.
Okay, let's come back to it later. So we've got the hyperscalers building out these data centers, increasing significantly their demand for electricity. They are also in the corporate sector. They have some of the most ambitious net zero goals, and they have large teams working out the transition plans. Think about this. That creates demand for offsets in the carbon market. as well as demand for investing directly in renewables, or as we know in some cases, directly into nuclear power. So when you look at the carbon markets, where do you sort of see them today, and what role can they play if we can scale them up effectively, especially as we see this growth in electricity demand here in the U.S. and other parts of the world?
What part did you want to see about scaling?
Well, what role do you see carbon markets playing, as some of the biggest consumers of electricity are also some of the most ambitious with the net zero goals? You see them really ramping up their demand for credits?
Well, yes, some of them are quiet about it, and others are very public about it. So Microsoft just did the largest nature-based offtake agreement with Rubicon, which is the company I chair, a carbon credits company. But the carbon credits company that's going to be a player in the future also has to become a co-developer. So you have to have the money to co-develop something that is going to pass muster, not only with Microsoft, but third parties that will evaluate it, like B0 and others. Because Tom Montag is the CEO and I'm the chairman, we both came from Bank of America. We were the co-chairs of the climate finance group at B of A. We want to apply financial criteria to all of this and create a framework that is familiar to the financial world. So you could see credits as a commodity. You could also see it as an asset in the future. But let's use Microsoft. They buy a lot of carbon credits. Google also buys carbon credits. Google did something else. They bought a company called Intersect, which the parent company to Rubicon, TPG, where I also am an advisor, was a huge investor in Intersect Power, which is once a venture, uh, you know, darling. Private equity got involved. TPG was a big player with Intersect. Intersect was sold, I think, for something like $4.7 billion to Google. They'll operate it as a separate company. They're in Texas. The energy will be largely renewable, but not all renewable. Some of it will be natural gas. It's probably 2/3 renewable, 1/3 natural gas. And meanwhile, because of the natural gas, they will continue to have the need for credits just on that alone. And they're interested in doing things that are discernible, can be evaluated, and will pass muster. The trouble, I think, with carbon credits right now is they're mostly nature based, and we could do so much more. We do carbon capture too, but it's super expensive. And biomass and biochar also expensive. But honestly, companies could put just cash in. Just stay with me for a minute. They do their carbon audit. They have a delta. It's real. They don't have green steel yet. They put money instead into just a pie in the sky, a renewable power plant in Vietnam, which needs the concessionary capital, if you will, to get it going. But everybody could participate in the PPA in the back end, the power plant, the agreement of people buying it, and everyone would have an asset then. So these are early discussions going on, but they're happening. And I would say companies in the US aren't saying anything about their carbon footprint, obviously, but they are quietly doing the work. I think they are doing it slower than they were, but they are doing it.
So let's return to this example of funding, for example, a renewable project in Vietnam. We can think about it in any number of developing countries where the financial markets are not as developed as they are here in the US. And one thing we hear about is that one of the challenges in building out renewables has been the cost of financing.
Right.
Where do you see potentially credit markets helping to lower those transaction costs of financing a project so you can really scale up? Where a lot of rapid growth in electricity demand is occurring in developing countries?
It's not going to happen unless you have concessionary capital. It's just not going to happen. Um, I participated in dozens of uh, efforts to do, a stack of different financing. So a development bank, uh, another development bank, a European bank, a um, a big philanthropy, and B of A, trying to do capital stack. All of us with different criteria, different end dates, accepting different returns, and it took so long, and it was a party of one. You couldn't reproduce it.
Right.
And I know many banks have done this. I think the answer is going to be carbon credits because you can get them very quickly. If companies feel that they got to fill the delta, um, that can be the concessionary capital. And if they can get the credits and it's all transparent, and you see that in fact a renewable factory did happen, and so they're decarbonizing. This is very frustrating to me because it seems so obvious, but um, I think the NGOs and the capital community have to come together to say, how do you make this happen? Let's stop with the we should do and lectures, and how do you make this happen?
You mentioned earlier concerns about greenwashing.
Right.
Um, how do we address some of these concerns about greenwashing? Because in some cases there's an ounce of truth to it, but sometimes we have a few bad cases that then get applied generally to an entire activity. How do we think about ways in which we can enhance the credibility of offset credits to address those concerns that they're just paper transactions to improve one's green reputation?
Well, I think there was plenty of greenwashing, but how it got there is a little different than how it's been expressed. Companies began their effort to decarbonize, but they really had no standard. I mean, there was I could go through the alphabet soup of standards. But when I tell you there are thousands of them, I mean there are thousands of them. And it's like a Venn diagram. None of them are quite what the other is. So you're looking to please one, but you didn't quite please the other. And then you have ones like CSRD that you have to do in Europe, but that doesn't match up with what is in another space. So it's very confusing. We need standardization. We need carbon accounting. We need standardization on scope 1, 2, and 3. We need a reality that 1 and 2 is still very hard to do. We need people to transparently and consistently report, which was happening uh, just 4 years ago. It was beginning to happen with this TCFD, which has become something else. But the point is, we were all doing it. And I think that we should have done more. But in the meantime, and I'll give you an example from B of A, this has to be 10, 15 years ago. We were doing a carbon audit. We did need to do some offsets. We had very little we needed to do in offsets. Why? Because we're a service company, not a manufacturing company. Thus, we didn't have much of the delta, but we had a little. So I oversaw it. We bought these credits. I will resist telling you all about the credits other than they were in the Amazon. We saw the evidence that looked like it was a reduction of destruction. I'm not sure that it was all kosher. I mean, later, now 10 years later, we more recently did things that we could see and were more viable and had been validated, but the validation wasn't happening then. So when John Oliver gets on and talks about windmills or the Amazon, and he's talking about projects that happened 10 years ago, in an effort that was quite real, we were actually trying to do something. it has a paralyzing effect on the business community, which is not lily white. I mean, I'm sure there was stuff that was going on that was sort of not for anything, for PR purposes. But the fact is, companies mostly account for what they do. They do not just um, spend money foolishly. They look to get a return. So I would say the greenwashing was more minimal than people think. And at this point, let me just go back to reminding everyone we have other issues now. Supply chain really matters on renewable. We can do things less expensively, so it helps the bottom line. AI is a huge opportunity, and we do all pay attention to this energy security. And each one of them has so much green opportunity. That's where we're all focused.
Um, So one thing we saw with the financial sectors you alluded to earlier are these alliances, GFANs and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, where there is this kind of opportunity then for leaders in the financial sector to start to at least sort of share practices, share insights, learn from each other. Our colleague at HBS, Peter Tufano, has done some research looking at the impact of these alliances. I'd love to hear from you. What do you think they achieved, and what do you think are some of the key takeaways or learnings from the Alliance experience?
Well, as you know, the alliances sort of fell apart. Why did they fall apart? Because we couldn't get, we did meet, but we needed the standards. We needed agreement on the standards. It turned out that they did not want to. The larger community wouldn't have accepted the standards coming from the banking community. Okay, so where were they going to come from? Should we use the European framework? The problem was it was all stick, no carrot.
Mhm.
So it was hard to figure out how to monetize that, if you will. Then carbon credits sort of got thrown off the table because a science-based SBTI came in and said they didn't want to use carbon credits, but they said it after the fact of GFANs and this agreement. So the banks and the asset managers started to sort of quietly walk away. However, in their own practices, I just repeat, they see the risks of coastal erosion, fires, etc. They see the opportunity of AI and renewables. They recognize the countries want to truly be energy independent and want to buy renewables. This is a banking opportunity. It's such a panacea that nobody is missing it. This is what they want to do, and to bring China in. China is China an enemy? Are they the adversary? I'll tell you one thing: they're certainly the competitor, and America has, at the moment, for reasons I think we all know, has tied one hand behind our back in terms of uh, competing on renewables, and China is wiping the floor with EVs. It's true that EVs are less popular here, um, but to use Ford as an example, and I know you had the head of public policy in, but as you know, the Jim Farley drives a Chinese luxury car. I don't know if I can say Xiaomi SU7, I think. BYD in is a Chinese car company. You can see Brazil, Belgium, you name Korea, they're driving Chinese cars. So while the US automotive industry wrote off $50 billion last year, so that happened, they want to be in business 10 years from now. And to be in business 10 years from now, they have got to be able to compete on EV. And so they know that their factories have to be different. They have to need their labor problems will be a problem, and also assembly will be a problem. So they generally go to a different state to begin that work. Um, but Jim Farley is quite clear that he in order to make Ford more than 120-year old a company, and he may not be the CEO at the time, they have got to be on EV. So these things, we may have only 10% of the market, and China may have 60%, but they may be overproducing. I think we have better innovation. Capital markets is going to beat a government program. This is just very frustrating.
Fair enough. Let's go to some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So I'll do a set of these, and then I have one final question after that, and then I want to open it up to our audience for questions. First, one climate technology that you think is undervalued today?
Nuclear fusion. It's not that it's undervalued, it's taking a while and it's very expensive, but I think it will be a game changer.
When?
Within the decade, but I don't know.
Okay. One policy tool that is underappreciated for accelerating decarbonization?
Policy tool. We need standards.
One area of climate finance where we will see major innovation in the next decade?
Well, AI. I mean, it's so obvious, but AI will beget a whole lot of companies doing renewables, a whole lot of companies doing steel, a whole lot of companies doing cement because they have facilities they have to build. They're going to use too much water. So there's going to be a water issue. So I think that will be one. The other one I think is going to be in farmland, grassland, that sort of thing. About 70% of the world's soil is degraded, and we've got to come up with a way to make it more arable, to get greater yield and use less water. So I think that's a real opportunity.
One misconception about the role of Wall Street in climate action?
Well, I think the perception is that Wall Street is stiff arming environmental progress, and it's not. But it doesn't. Wall Street is, 1,000 companies, many more than that, but just say it's 1,000 companies. Each one is doing something in this space, but unsure of what to do. So I'll just take my years at Bank of America and then fast forward to what I'm doing at TPG. I see a whole lot of very smart companies very anxious to make work business opportunities with renewables, to fix their carbon footprint because they think they'll learn from that. But again, if you're always going to be cast as the offending greenwasher and you have no standards, there are some problems.
One piece of advice you would give to students interested in climate finance careers?
I think this is going to be in every bit of finance. So I think it's a huge opportunity. And you are so far ahead of everybody if you understand AI and its needs. So forget AI, its needs. How much renewable, where the building's going to be, how much water they're going to need, and how you're going to finance that, or how you're going to legally deal with that.
So let me close with one question, and then Liz, if we can circulate the mic, that would be great. What is your overall outlook for climate finance over the next decade?
I think it's going to be huge. I mean, AI alone is going to make it huge. I think the EV world will change in the US just competitively. We drive cars for 8 years, but the next time you drive a car, it's sort of over time, the combustible engine will not be the thing and EV will be, and there'll be other things that come along with it.
Great. So we'll open it up for questions from the audience. As a reminder, please introduce yourself. And as a second reminder, question ends with a question mark. Let's start with Jim, please, up here in the front. Ricardo.
Jim Stock, director of the Salat Institute. There are many, many questions that I have, but I will just have one. You and Joe talked a fair amount about carbon credits and carbon credit markets. You said you made a really interesting comment. You'd like to have credits become a financial commodity. So how does that actually happen? And so let me just one side comment. We know that commodities, grain, wheat, number 2 red wheat or whatever on the Chicago exchange, there's gradations, it comes with different moisture contents. It has delivery at different locations, different times of the year, different protein. And then there's adjustments that are made to a contract, and those are all spelled out. The payments are spelled out. I mean, is that what you sort of envision? How do you actually how do you actually make this work? And then sort of the next thing is wheat, you can measure the moisture content, you can measure the protein content. Measurement, is more of a challenge. And I don't mean in a narrow sense, but I mean sort of in terms of contract validation. So how do you actually turn this into a financially tradable commodity, a carbon credit? And I'm thinking of NBS, nature-based solutions, primarily.
Yeah. So my partner, Tom Montag, would rather not see it as a commodity, but it could be a commodity. How could it be a commodity? In the nature-based elements, all of those things are happening. You are figuring out the size of whatever, let's say it's a tree. You're reforesting someplace. The size of the tree, how much carbon is it sequestering, in what time frame, and how successful was it? It's like wheat. And the trouble is, it needs to be a big enough market. So there's a lot of things that happen. It has to have these standards that are kind of weak at the moment, but we're trying to apply real standards. The amount of time we're spending on being validated, reporting, measurement is impressive, shall we say, but it's how you become a commodity. We're doing all of that so that you could, and Microsoft, which is the largest buyer of this offtake that we're doing for them, they're looking at every piece of it too. We can tell you on that tree exactly what you would want to know on that wheat field. And that's how it's going to work. But you got to scale it. And right now it's just not scaled. It would be scaled, though, if we were more honest about. I don't know, by the way, if we're going to get to net zero at 2050. Me, I don't see it. I think natural gas, for instance, will be around a long time. And McKinsey would agree with that. But I do think that as companies become more transparent, they tell you they have a delta, they have to buy these carbon credits, they become completely transparent. You can start doing what we're doing with Microsoft on a scalable basis.
Alexander.
Thank you so much. My name is Alexander Landi. I'm fellow at Harvard's Advanced Leadership Initiative. Thank you for a brilliant presentation. And I would like to pick up the point about hyperscalers integrating upstream. Well, we see that in the United States. In Europe, I am trying to help a renewables developer, which is bringing power from Northern Africa to Europe, 85% firm power, enhanced with batteries and everything. Well, I thought this would be no-brainer for hyperscalers. Mistake. Energy companies are on board, very large energy companies, but we didn't have any traction with hyperscalers. So in case of Intersect, this was a combined developer of data centers and renewable power. So shall the European developers of renewable power try to integrate with data center developers to be attractive for hyperscalers? Or is there any other way how we can kind of square this thing? Thank you.
Well, the path on Intersect was a little different. I mean, it was once a venture capital play, became a private equity play. Private equity is, Google was one of the investors, early, not on venture, but at the private equity level. And that's how that worked. So in the case of a European piece, I think actually the traction you have is right. It's for an energy company will buy it so that or invest in it to scale it. or a private equity firm could have, but just say it's the energy company. They'll scale it, and then they'll begin conversations with the buyer, the AI buyer. But that begins to, the energy companies will be having those they are having those conversations right now. And the private equity firms are coming in to try to invest in this too. But they're investing with the energy company that's buying your product. Probably, so they're not, you're trying to get the pull through to the originals, and they're the intermediaries that will probably make it happen.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Megan next, please.
Thank you, Anne. It's great to see you here. I'm going to ask what I feel like is the very obvious question. I think the most used word was standards, right? That's what you need. That's what you think the industry is looking for. And this has evaded the industry for some time. So looking ahead, where do you think those standards can come from? Like what's a vehicle for standards and that will be complied with? Or do you think this is not a fruitful area until the politics change? Or, what's the relationship between the politics and getting viable standards that will be adhered to? And is there a role for non-government entities to provide help in building these standards?
Well, there's certainly a role for non-government, as long as in the NGO world, if they can understand capitalism, that's the difference. As opposed to, there are a lot of nonprofits and NGOs, they opened the door to the environmental movement. They were the leaders. Companies were, very slow followers. But once they got there, they needed to be able to apply capitalism. And the conversations had too many, always was about what one should do. But in business, you have shareholders, you have employees, you have customers. The way you think is just different. Can you apply this and make it work? So we need standards. I think if we had a friendlier government, we don't need policies. In other words, the IRA was great, but actually AI will be 2 and 3 times what the IRA could do without any tax credits. But you have to, if you had a convening, it would be good. There is a lot of effort around carbon accounting right now. And it's, the biggest, by the way, funders of that are the fossil fuel companies. But they're doing it because they think it's inevitable that they're going to be called to account. So they'd rather just have one standard. And I think Wall Street will get more involved. AI is such a huge opportunity. They're not going to let that pass. And if standards will help, they will do that. But to do green bonds, the way we did it is because it was sort of the same problem on a minuscule basis. We were able to put together this international carbon capital markets group. It was sort of a band of NGO, government, but U.S. Treasury. U.S. Treasury was the linchpin for it. So, for instance, if U.S. Treasury would get involved, it would help.
Great. Megan, let's go to Akash next, please.
So my name is Akash Deep. I teach finance here at the Kennedy School. And my question is actually the other half of the question that Jim Stock asked you. If carbon credits could be commodities, but then you also said they don't have to be commodities. They can be something else.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious to hear what that something else might look like.
They could be an asset. You could buy the land that you're talking about developing. You could commoditize you could become part of the PPA for the renewable power plant. So you're giving the money early on, but you want to be part of the payoff when they for the power plant accounting. So that would it would become an asset for you. And those are 2 examples.
But it would not be as standardized as a commodity. It might be.
No, in that case, it wouldn't be a commodity.
The third row, please, Ricardo.
Thank you so much for being here. My name is Sonali, and I'm a second-year Masters of Public Policy student at the Kennedy School. Prior to HKS, I used to work for a major project developer of high-quality World Bank-backed cook stove carbon credits that just closed operations in East Africa. And my question is related to the sustainability of carbon credits as a revenue generation mechanism. Do you think that companies that rely on these credits to subsidize solutions for low income governments and low income consumers can solely rely on carbon credits, especially given the political risk? Or do they necessarily have to diversify? And if they do have to diversify, then what could be the solutions for low income countries that can't attract the kind of concessional capital?
I don't know what the answer is to that because they need concessionary capital. And it's out there. And it's out there as a carbon credit. The capital stacks that have been attempted before are just not reproducible. Somebody in that stack falls apart, and the project has got high risk to it to begin with. And on cook stoves, I know that there was one that was Chapter 11, or they went out of business. But there's another one that it's the first carbon credit verified by the UN 10 years after the project began. 10 years. And now we have a cook stove carbon credit approval. Ridiculous. So it has to be part of the financial stack that's understood. I think there are other things to do. I don't think carbon credits is the only thing to do. It's just a thing to do. Okay.
Thanks. In the back, Brenda.
I'm getting up so you can see me. Hi, I'm Vrinda. I'm also an MPP2 at the Kennedy School. My question was maybe a little bit more sort of zoomed out about your experience and how you draw the line between, any incremental effort is better than no effort, and with something like natural gas, and funding these kinds of technology or financing these kinds of technologies more and more would lead to a delay in quote unquote actual climate action, which might end up being a lot more effective, because natural gas requires credits, which require standardization, which, I mean, I used to work in scope 3 emissions measurement and standardization, and it hasn't happened in so long, like Professor O'Sullivan said. So I guess my question is, where do you draw the line?
Well, just to give you sort of the thing I'm thinking about right now is what happens if China invades Taiwan, we lose our access to computer chips, semiconductors. That's an 11% drop in GDP in the US, which is twice what the financial crisis was. I think about things like that. And it's related to this in that you have to think globally and then you have to act individually. When in my time at B of A, the environmental issue was, and all the things that you think about with it, was an ESG kind of thing, a good thing to do. But as we got into it, we recognized we have a carbon footprint. We could actually reduce our energy use, so we would pay less, not more, if we did some retrofitting. That was just a personal, realization. And then we recognized our clients had the same concerns. We needed standards, so we sort of created them. Scopes 1, 2, and 3 were very helpful. Then we went out into the renewable world to see if we could accelerate. The IRA was helpful in the tax credits because it accelerated EV. So one thing begot another, but you didn't really see the pull through until kind of now, where the environment is these three things. It's its own thing, I guess, but AI has changed it, supply chain has changed it, and energy security has changed it. And out of energy security, I'm just saying those chips are very important to the production of renewable in terms of just sort of all the work that has to be done. If you cut that off, we're in trouble like that minute. So you have to think in supply chain all the way through. And I think about all these things at once, but I think I didn't answer your question. I just, you're asking for the sort of the history of how these things happen, and they don't happen in a linear fashion because the world doesn't operate in a linear fashion.
We have in economics literature measures of economic policy uncertainty. Over the past year or so, I think it's fair to say, and I'm looking at Professor Stock, those indexes reached all-time highs. And we now have an ongoing conflict in Europe, a new conflict in the Middle East. You brought up the prospect of conflict in Asia. From the financial perspective, it seems like this kind of tremendous uncertainty would have a chilling effect. Help us understand, like, how, when you think about the kind of advice you provide or how you think about it within the company, how do you manage this increase in uncertainty in the world around us?
You look for the opportunity.
What's the opportunity right now?
Well, chips domestically are an opportunity. Renewables are a big opportunity. Solar, wind, and storage, battery storage, huge opportunity. I don't care where you are. No, without the uncertainty just makes it more certain that you have to have energy independence. And I realize in the US, we have enough of it with fossil fuels, but the fossil fuel business knows that there's a ticking time clock on that. So I think we're looking at the opportunities. Do we think though the markets could get crushed? Yeah, we do. But there are things that you can do in terms of business. You're asking sort of two different questions. Can the market get crushed? Yep. Meanwhile, can you make money on opportunities? Yes.
Okay. Other questions from the audience? Willow.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Willow. I'm also a second year Master in Public Policy student. And I wanted to return to the point you made at the start about CBAM, the EU CBAM. And obviously CBAM has sparked a number of proposals about alternative ways to credit deductions for effective carbon rights paid. And so I wanted to ask your approach and kind of your perspective on some of these proposals, if you think there's merit to expanding the current belief on how to credit for carbon prices paid, or if you think, people are throwing too many ideas at what is already a very complex new policy.
I don't think people are throwing too many ideas. I think that we're evolving as an industry, and what we need is standards. The ideas we need to explore and expand the ideas, but we need to create standards that will work for everybody.
Hi, my name is Jun. I'm a second year student in Master in International Development. My question is, so you mentioned during the talk that the AI and renewable come together, but my understanding is that because of the AI data center, or there's a narrative that says we need more energy demand, which justify the increase in traditional electricity like a coal power plant. And I was wondering, what do you think about this?
I don't see much in the way of coal fire plants. Not in the US. And I realize this has been a growth opportunity from this administration, but many of them were shut down. Are you talking about the US or do you want to talk about globally? But US is really where it's happening. So I'm going to US. It takes 5 years to get them back up and running. This administration will be gone. There'll be no bank that wants to underwrite a coal plant that is never really going to make it and get closed 5 years later. So I don't see that. What I do see is, you're right, fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, will probably elevate, but they will be a smaller part of the total denominator. So you'll, just for purposes of this, maybe you'll originally have half and half. 3 years from now will be 2/3 renewable, 1/3 natural gas. I think if nuclear fusion comes along, that will take out the natural gas completely. So I think it's over time. You're right, though, that it could be a growth opportunity in the short term. McKinsey thinks that 2050, you still got 40 or 50% of the energy is coming from fossil fuels, but it's because the denominator is so much bigger in 2050. I have no idea if that's true or not true, but I do know the denominator is expanding at such a pace. And AI is just today's thing. I don't know what tomorrow's opportunity is. Water is a problem here, big problem, because there isn't a alternative to water. So renewables are an alternative to a fossil fuel. There's no alternative to water, and they need a lot of it, and it may jeopardize communities that they're in. So I think water is a problem here.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah, a research fellow from Ash Center, Kennedy School. And you mentioned the importance of standards. In my work, I helped lead the development of a climate finance standard, which was designed to guide financial institutions in assessing climate-aligned lending. From your perspective, what are the effective ways to promote and scale the adoption of these standards across financial institutions and markets? Thank you.
They have to be seen as legitimate. They have to be embraced. They have to meet legal criteria, and we have to collapse all of the ones that are out there into something the markets understand. Now, in the capital markets world, there are a lot of, there's not one thing and we all use one thing, but we know what the standard is, whatever it is. We know what the variations on the standards are, and we operate off of them. That's what we need. And my feeling is the problem probably is it's being done outside the financial world, and it needs to be done inside the financial world and blessed by the NGOs, et cetera. So it's the NGOs that are creating the standards, and the capital markets do not know how to respond to them because they don't fit anything. I think it has to be the opposite. And if there were a US government that was in favor of where we think we're going, you could get the financial regulators to, that could happen pretty quickly.
Great. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Grace. I'm also MPP student here, second year. Thank you for your brilliant idea to becoming the carbon graded to the commodity with standards. But that means the price signal will probably become very weak.
I'm sorry, the what?
The price signal will become weak.
Oh.
Yeah, will become weak. So I'm curious, from a long-term perspective, will that help or hurt the project financing? Compared with the long-term offtake agreements. Thank you.
Well, that's a complicated question. First of all, what's an offtake? An offtake is an agreement, a contract that the developer will create enough carbon credits that go through a very rigorous review to be considered a carbon credit. And in the case of Microsoft, these are decades out. and you work backwards. So the carbon credit brokers have had real problems. You have to become a co-developer. That's the first thing. You have to become a co-developer. Therefore, you need to get financed. Talking about that flywheel of venture, private equity, et cetera. The carbon credit company has to get enough money that they can become a co-developer. On the other side of pricing, I don't really see the pricing being a problem because it is the value of if it's a commodity or if it's an asset or if it's a tax, it could also be a tax. You can value it pretty easily. Not everything is the same. The decarbonization of a tree is going to be different than carbon capture, is going to be different than biochar, and it's going to be different than if you become an asset to financing. But the financial world can deal with that. That's not the problem. The problem is an agreement on creating the standards.
So before we wrap up, let me note, I'm sure the students all know this, next week we're on spring break. I'll be coming to Cambridge, Massachusetts for spring break. I'm sure some of you will be going elsewhere. I hope you enjoy your break. We'll reconvene the seminar in 2 weeks' time. We'll be hosting Richard Sandor, who will be talking about his recent book, Carbon Hunters, and about his contributions to carbon markets and pollution markets over the decades. So please join us for that. Thanks to Caps, who was here earlier, but I think he left. He's agreed to reschedule his seminar for April 13th. And finally, please join me in thanking Anne Finucane for her phenomenal insights for today and sharing your time with us today. Thank you so much, Anne. That was great.